When you hear the word war, what comes to mind? Maybe it's tanks rolling through streets, jets screaming overhead, soldiers charging trenches, explosions lighting up distant front lines. War today isn't what you think. While conflicts still take place on land, sea, and sky, the most decisive battlefield is now the human mind. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the 7 new rules of war. Rules already being used by the world's most cunning actors. Once you understand these rules, you won't just see conflict differently, you'll see the entire world differently. Because the most powerful weapons don't fire bullets anymore. They spread doubt, collapse economies, and hijack narratives. Wars today aren't just high-tech, they're low-tech. They're not even mostly fought between countries anymore, but between nation-states and ideologies, corporations, and private armies, where victory doesn't come from force alone, but from shaping what your enemy believes is true. You might wonder, why should any of this matter to you? Because in this new era of war, no one is a bystander. Whether you're navigating daily life, building a company, managing investments, or shaping policy, these new rules already shape your reality. They influence what you see online, what you pay at the gas pump, what risks your business faces, even who gets elected. This new face of warfare isn't just about generals and governments anymore. It's about you. Those who understand this truth will adapt, endure, and thrive. Those who don't will be misled, exposed, and maybe even undone. And while the analysis you're about to see is my own, many of the core insights are inspired by Sean McFate's powerful book, The New Rules of War. That said, let's begin. On the morning of June 6, 1944, at the height of World War II, thousands of Allied soldiers from the United States, Canada, Britain, Australia, and other countries landed on the beaches of Nazi-occupied France during D-Day. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history. From that day on, the Allies pushed east, through shattered towns and frozen forests, fighting brutal battles against the Germans like the Battle of the Bulge, where entire divisions of soldiers and armored columns clashed against each other. Meanwhile, on the other side of Europe, the Soviet army was surging west towards Germany. After defeating the Nazis at the Battle of Stalingrad, they rolled through Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland, unleashing armored assaults at the Battle of Kursk, the biggest tank battle in history. Eventually, they pushed their way to the German capital itself, and at the bloody Battle of Berlin, they defeated what was left of the Nazis and ended the Second World War in Europe. These are typically the images most of us still have in our heads when we think about war. Huge national armies clashing on battlefields, flags raised high in victory, and treaties signed in grand halls. This was the world of conventional war, envisioned by Karl von Clausewitz. The 19th century Prussian general famously said, "War is the continuation of politics by other means." His ideas still dominate Western military doctrine today, that war is state on state, won decisively through firepower, and ended through negotiation. The thing is, conventional wars like that have become increasingly rare. Of course, some conflicts today still involve things like tanks, soldiers, and fighter jets. But think about it. Since World War II, how many wars can you name where two states clashed in massive tank battles, infantry assaults, and fighter jet dogfights? It's happened, but far less often than we imagine. Most wars today are messier, harder to define, and rarely look like the ones we read about in history books. There are several reasons why that's the case. In the information age we now live in, fueled by the internet, the media, and the rise of social platforms, knowledge and information are no longer rare. They're everywhere. Also, anyone with a phone can film, upload, and shape a global narrative. So in this hyper-connected world where everyone can see the live updates from events way on the other side of the world in real time, starting a highly visible conventional war with things like tanks, soldiers, jets, and everything else it entails risks triggering global condemnation, sanctions, the collapse of political support, or diplomatic isolation. Costs many states and politicians just can't afford. Not to mention that nuclear weapons turn major state-on-state conflict into mutual suicide. On top of that, the same technologies and platforms that have democratized knowledge and information, as well as enabled global connectivity, have also made it easy for radical ideas to spread, and for those who hold them to find each other, to coordinate, and to mobilize, which has led to the rise of extremist groups and other non-state actors. This has eroded the power of states, especially the power of failed and fragile states, creating vicious circles where weakened states breed instability, creating vacuums that non-state actors fill, which chips away even further at the power of those weakened states. All of those forces converge to shape the age we now live in, where most wars aren't declared. They unfold in the shadows, not out in the open, and they're no longer fought between nations, but between states and networks, militias, cartels, and terrorist groups. That means they rarely end cleanly. No surrender ceremonies, no peace treaties, they just smolder, dragging on until one side fades or fractures. This isn't really anything new. If anything, it's a return to how war looked like for most of human history: messy, decentralized, and full of gray zones. The kind of war that existed before the modern nation state. Think mercenaries in Renaissance Italy, tribal warfare in pre-colonial Africa, or feudal Japan, where shifting allegiances and prolonged skirmishes blurred the line between war and peace entirely. But many militaries, especially those shaped by Western doctrine, are still preparing for conventional wars that rarely happen anymore. They're bracing for great power clashes, but not for proxy militias, terrorist networks, or for drone swarms. There's an old saying that goes, generals always prepare to fight the last war, especially the last war they won. Think about this for a moment. The West's last truly decisive military victory, and the US's for that matter, was World War II. But today's wars look less and less like that. And preparing with yesterday's victories in mind may be the surest way to lose tomorrow's battles, because victory itself no longer belongs to whoever has the most firepower or the most advanced technology. And as we'll see next, the shinier the weapon, the easier it is to blind yourself with it. So the belief that technology is the answer might be the most dangerous illusion of all. On October 7th, 2023, the world watched in disbelief as one of the most technologically advanced militaries on Earth was blindsided by one of the most unexpected and horrific attacks in recent history. Hamas, a militant Islamist organization that governs Gaza and is designated as a terrorist group by the US, the EU, and others, launched a coordinated assault on Israel, not with stealth bombers or with cyber weapons, but with things like motorcycles, bulldozers, and homemade rockets. They breached the billion-dollar border fence separating Gaza from Israel, completely overwhelmed surveillance systems, stormed Israeli towns, massacred roughly 1,200 people, and took around 250 hostages with them back into Gaza, all with low-tech tools and raw coordination. In addition to the horrific human cost, it was a strategic embarrassment for Israel, and it showed in real time that even the most high-tech systems can be undone by cheap tactics and human resolve. This is the reality of modern warfare. Technology creates capability, but it no longer guarantees victory or even deterrence. And while it's easy to imagine war today as something out of a sci-fi movie with things like robots, autonomous drones, and AI decision-making, the truth is this: those high-tech tools often become liabilities, because the more technologically advanced a military becomes, the more opportunities it creates for others to exploit. For example, modern militaries now depend on GPS for just about everything: navigation, targeting, and communication. But GPS can be jammed, and if it is jammed, Even the most advanced fighter jets or tanks can be rendered pretty much useless because the people inside them, relying totally on technology, often don't know how to operate without it. Over-reliance on tech risks dulling the fundamentals, and the pursuit of sleek systems often erodes basic skills. But not only that, wars today are, in many ways, getting more low-tech, not high-tech. The democratization of technology has effectively lowered the barrier to entry for warfare. Armed groups no longer need billion-dollar budgets. They just need access and intent. Today, insurgents can build entire drone armies using things you can order off of Amazon, some primitive explosives, and the same kind of GPS you have in your car right now. Modern enemies now weaponize the mundane, not just consumer drones, but also things like rental trucks. These things are cheap, widely available, and very difficult to defend against. And because they're so ordinary and just so ubiquitous, they're also very difficult to preempt or stigmatize without totally disrupting everyday life. For example, the military would have a really hard time banning all consumer drones. And you can't just ban rental trucks without causing massive disruption to everyday logistics and civilian activity. This normalcy gives these tools camouflage. They disappear into daily life until they're suddenly used for violence. That's not just hard to defend against. It's hard to even talk about without undermining civil liberties or social trust. In this new era of war, high-tech tools are often more vulnerable than low-tech ones, and low-tech tools are often more effective than high-tech ones. What all of this shows is that in modern warfare, the most decisive factors aren't advanced technologies. They're human ones, like training, intelligence, and adaptability, but also things like resolve, endurance, and patience. And there are already powerful examples that prove it. During the Vietnam War, the United States intervened to support South Vietnam against the communist North. The US was vastly superior with technology and firepower that far exceeded anything the North Vietnamese had. But the North Vietnamese outlasted the US. And today, the Vietnam War is largely remembered as a disaster in the collective memory of most Americans. Years later in an interview, a former North Vietnamese soldier was asked how they were able to ultimately prevail against an American army that was superior in almost every way. He answered, "The Americans had the watches, but we had the time." Victory doesn't necessarily belong to the strong anymore, but to the cunning. That's why, time and time again, over the past decades, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, and in Lebanon in 1982, we've seen technologically superior powers routinely outmaneuvered and outlasted by vastly inferior foes. That's not to say that technology is no longer a factor in warfare, because it clearly is, and it always will be. The point is, technology alone is no longer decisive. And if it doesn't guarantee victory, or even doesn't guarantee deterrence, then over-investing in it at the expense of human factors, things like training, adaptability, morale, intelligence, and local legitimacy, creates a dangerous imbalance. And nowhere is this imbalance more obvious than in the US's most expensive weapon, the F-35 fighter jet. The whole program to develop this jet has already cost $1.7 trillion. If the program were a country, it would have the 11th largest economy in the world. The F-35 fighter jet has been outfitted with technology that costs trillions of dollars, and yet it can't even outmaneuver an F-16, a much older model of jet, in a dogfight. The thing is, in today's world, wars aren't just decided in the skies, or even on the battlefield. More and more, they're being shaped in the space between war and peace. In early 2014, something strange happened in Crimea, a peninsula in southern Ukraine that had once been part of the Soviet Union. One day, men in green military uniforms appeared. They had no flags, no insignias, no national markings of any kind. They arrived suddenly, seized key buildings, surrounded Ukrainian bases, and raised Russian flags high over government offices. No formal invasion, no declaration of war, just calm, coordinated force. The world didn't know what to call them. The media dubbed them little green men. Russia denied they were Russian soldiers, but later on, President Putin casually admitted that they were. By then, it was too late, and Crimea had already been absorbed back into Russia. That wasn't just a geopolitical maneuver. It was a signal that the old rules no longer applied. What made the operation so successful wasn't brute force. It was strategic ambiguity. Russia won without officially going to war. For most of modern history, we were taught to see war and peace as opposites. One ended, the other began. The laws of armed conflict in the minds of most Western strategists were built on that binary. You followed different rules depending on which side of the line you were on, and you behaved differently in war compared with how you behaved in peace, which made the distinction between them absolutely crucial. But that binary no longer exists. One of the main reasons that distinction has collapsed is the world has become hyper-connected. Nations are inextricably tied together by trade, capital, digital infrastructure, and diplomacy. Theoretically, that should make war less likely, because the costs are just too high. But war does not stop just because it's costly, because power still matters, and influence still matters. So when full-scale conflict just becomes too risky, adversaries shift tactics and wars go underground. Instead of battles, we get tariffs, and instead of invasions, we get influence operations. It's no longer about tanks crossing borders. It's about disinformation campaigns, economic coercion, election meddling, cyber attacks, and proxy militias. The result is the line between war and peace has become blurrier than ever, and ambiguity has become a weapon. Consider the following. What do you call it when a country floods your media with lies, when they interfere in your elections, or when they quietly buy up your infrastructure, film production companies, and professional sports teams? Is that war, or is it peace? It's not obvious, and that's the point. If you can operate without being seen as a combatant, then you can act without triggering the consequences. That's why plausible deniability has become the defining tactic of modern warfare. When the actors aren't wearing uniforms, when the attacks don't leave smoke trails, then aggression becomes debatable. And sometimes you don't even need to act at all, because in today's world, the threat of force can be just as powerful as force itself. Troop buildups, naval drills, or even a single leaked statement can achieve strategic goals without a single shot being fired. That's the logic of psychological pressure. Intimidate, unsettle, and control your opponent's decision-making without ever stepping onto the battlefield. To see just how real this is, consider what happened in the lead-up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As Russian troops massed on the Ukrainian border in late 2021 and early 2022, Vladimir Putin had all the leverage in the world. Presidents, prime ministers, and diplomats all flew to Moscow, hoping to avert disaster. The threat alone forced the world to engage on Putin's terms. But the moment he actually invaded on that cold winter morning in February 2022, all that leverage evaporated. Suddenly, he wasn't a strategist operating in the shadows. He was an aggressor, triggering severe economic sanctions, international condemnation, and military backlash. In other words, Russia had more power when it was threatening war than when it was waging one. This makes Russia's invasion of Ukraine all the more surprising, because strategic ambiguity had worked so well for Vladimir Putin 8 years before when he annexed Crimea. But in a sense, the invasion of Ukraine actually serves as an exception that confirms the rule, showing us exactly why conventional war has become so rare. Because of all the consequences that came with it, never mind the fact that the war itself has become a stalemate. It confirms why most actors now prefer the gray zone between war and peace, where they can exploit ambiguity, avoid consequences, and manipulate perception without crossing a line that forces a response. China is a master at exploiting this gray zone. Right now in the South China Sea, it's harassing vessels, building militarized islands, and deploying maritime militias, all while purposely staying just below the threshold of what might be perceived as war. So in this new age of durable disorder, where warfare hides in the gray zones and in silence, where conflicts are rarely declared and never truly end, where ambiguity is the weapon and smoldering tension the norm, we live in war and peace at the same time. They no longer alternate, they coexist, sometimes side by side, sometimes indistinguishable, but never again truly separate. Since the start of the Israel-Hamas war that started in 2023, a new kind of warfare has been playing out every day. One that doesn't rely on tanks or planes, but on ethics, images, and perception. On one side, you have Israel, an advanced military power armed with precision weapons, cutting-edge technology, and overwhelming force. On the other hand, there's Hamas, militarily much weaker, but strategically agile. Hamas knows Israel is clearly superior in military terms, so it embeds its fighters, weapons, and command centers inside schools, inside hospitals, mosques, and residential neighborhoods. Because Hamas understands something essential and disturbing about the modern age of war. The more committed your enemy is to moral conduct, the more that morality can be turned into a weapon against them. And here's what I mean by that. There's very strong evidence that Israel undertakes extensive efforts to minimize civilian casualties. And while civilian suffering in Gaza has rightly sparked global concern, the story is much more complex than most headlines suggest. According to assessments done by the Modern War Institute at West Point Academy and other independent organizations, Israel has employed a range of measures to warn civilians during its operations in Gaza since 2023. It's dropped over 8 million leaflets warning Palestinian civilians to evacuate danger zones, sent more than 15 million text messages, made over 70,000 direct phone calls, and left 15 million voicemails to alert civilians of impending strikes. It also routinely aborts airstrikes if real-time drone, satellite, or field intelligence suggests civilians are still present at the target area. And the actual numbers tell a revealing story, one that directly contradicts what you've likely seen on the news or on social media. Independent military analysts and former top commanders like Richard Kemp, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan, David Petraeus, former US commander in Iraq and Afghanistan, and ex-CIA director, and John Spencer, chair of urban warfare studies at West Point Military Academy, all estimate that the civilian to combatant death ratio in Gaza is roughly 1-to-1. That means for every civilian killed, one combatant is killed. And to be sure, that number is devastating, and any loss of life is tragic. And yet, in the context of urban warfare, that ratio is significantly lower than the global average, where 3 to 4 civilians are killed for every combatant. For example, in the Battle of Hue during the Vietnam War, an estimated 4 civilians died for every combatant. In the first Battle of Grozny during the First Chechen War, that number was 5-to-1. And in the Battle of Fallujah during the Iraq War, it was roughly 3-to-1. And yet, in none of those battles were the fighters deliberately embedded amongst civilians, nor were hospitals, schools, or residential buildings systematically used as shields like they are in Gaza. None of this erases the very real devastation on the ground. Thousands of lives have been lost, and for those living in Gaza, the impact is absolutely catastrophic, no matter the intent behind any military action. The point is that the imagery of civilian suffering is what dominates the global narrative, while the extensive precautions Israel takes largely go unseen by the global public, which tells us something very important about the modern battlefield. It isn't just physical, it's emotional, it's visual, and it's viral. Hamas knows that in our information age, you don't need to just worry about defeating your enemy in combat if you can make the world turn against them. Hamas has exploited Israel's own moral code to constrain its actions. It has also exploited the world's moral sensitivity, knowing that images of suffering will obviously provoke outrage and diplomatic pressure, even when that suffering is the intended outcome of its own strategy. This is not to say that Israel's conduct should be immune from scrutiny. It shouldn't. And when it deserves criticism, it should receive it, like any actor in any war. In fact, what Hamas is doing right now, embedding itself in hospitals, schools, mosques, and residential areas, is itself a war crime committed against its own people. And it bears repeating, the suffering in Gaza is real, ongoing, and immense. I'm just making the point that in modern warfare, anything can be and is being weaponized. And the goal is no longer to just destroy your enemy's forces, but also their sense of moral clarity, their reputation, public support, and internal cohesion. The battlefield is no longer confined to land or to airspace. It's the human mind, and all of us are targets. The structure of our modern world doesn't just allow this, it enables it. Because in an age where perception is power, the tools to shape it have never been more advanced or more available to just about everyone. In our information mass media age, technology and social media allow anyone with a phone and internet connection to reach millions. So any actor, state or non-state, can inject whatever they want into the bloodstream of global consciousness for free and at scale. And now with AI, they can generate photos, videos, and things like deep fakes that aren't real, blurring the line between truth and fiction until no one can tell the difference. So why risk international backlash with a conventional military invasion when reshaping how a country is perceived can achieve the same strategic result without the cost or visibility? Why invest in a missile when you can shift the minds of voters, journalists, and diplomats for a fraction of the cost? In today's wars, destabilizing minds can be more effective than defeating armies. Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese strategist, said, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." He also said, "All warfare is based on deception." Today, those ideas are being taken to their logical extreme. So the defining aspect of modern wars is not overwhelming force. It's more about strategic subversion. And when it comes to that, information and morality aren't the only thing that's being weaponized. In 2015, Russia launched a massive air campaign in Syria to prop up the regime of Bashar al-Assad, the brutal ruler of Syria at the time. The Russians bombed several Syrian cities, including Aleppo, that had been partially overtaken by ISIS. On the surface, Russia's campaign and bombings look like a typical intervention, massive airstrikes and strategic support, but there was another goal hidden beneath it. Putin wanted to destabilize Europe and weaken the unity of the European Union. So by bombing those Syrian cities, he helped trigger a massive wave of refugees. Millions of people fled Syria and poured into Turkey and into Europe. That refugee crisis sparked political chaos across the continent. Far-right parties surged in popularity, borders tightened, and alliances frayed. As horrific as it sounds, Russia weaponized the fallout of refugee displacement and the immense suffering of the Syrian people to destabilize its opponents. In today's wars, the most effective weapons don't just destroy, because destabilizing an enemy through migration, undermining them through disinformation, and exploiting moral sensitivity all have one key benefit for the perpetrator: they don't look like war. Unlike missiles or tanks, these tactics are not as visible. They're meant to confuse, mislead, and to deceive, and the more you do that, the less likely you are to face any consequences. And when wars are fought in the shadows, when truth itself becomes a battlefield, there's less need for armies and more need for deniable force. Here's what most people don't realize about the war in Ukraine. One of the most important players in that war didn't wear Russian uniforms, didn't appear on official troop lists, and technically didn't even exist. They were called the Wagner Group. Not an army, not a government, a private military company, hired by Russia, funded through oil deals and backroom contracts, and unleashed as a deniable weapon of war. When Russian troops moved into Crimea and eastern Ukraine in 2022, Wagner soldiers followed, but officially, they weren't there. They operated in the shadows, fighting battles, seizing ground, and eliminating targets, without ever triggering the diplomatic alarms that official Russian forces would have. And Ukraine was really just the beginning. Across Africa, Wagner forces have popped up in country after country. In Libya, Mali, Sudan, the Central African Republic. They protect regimes, guard gold mines, and train local militias. Not for country, not for ideology, but for profit. They're paid in mineral rights, political influence, and cash, all without a single parliamentary vote. No official war declarations, and no accountability. And that's the deeper story most people miss. The rise of mercenary groups like the Wagner Group isn't just a Russian story. It's a glimpse of a broader global shift. Wars aren't always fought by states anymore. They're subcontracted. And mercenaries, once fringe players, are moving to the very center. Wagner isn't an anomaly, because the truth is, groups like this are becoming the dominant forces in 21st century warfare. And to understand why, it's important to look at the forces shaping modern conflict. Wars now play out in the shadows, with drones, disinformation, sanctions, and sabotage. So states and militaries need quiet capabilities. Covert, deniable, and disposable. And that's exactly what mercenaries offer. They give states something official armies can't: plausible deniability. If a mission goes sideways, no one has to admit anything. The state can shrug, or the client can deny, because the mercenaries don't officially exist. That's why so many of today's most sensitive military missions aren't even done by soldiers anymore. They're outsourced, often to private military companies like Constellus, or formerly known as Blackwater. In fact, most CIA operations today are now carried out by contractors. Most people imagine mercenaries as lone wolves, rogue fighters with absolutely no morals, no loyalty, and no discipline. But that image is outdated. Today's mercenaries are largely ex-special forces, intelligence operatives, and veterans from the world's top militaries. They work in coordinated units, they wear body cams, they sign non-disclosure agreements. This isn't the Wild West, it's corporate warfare. And it isn't a modern invention either. For most of history, mercenaries were the norm. The Bible mentions them. Ancient Greece used them. So did Hannibal. So did Rome. And during the Middle Ages, Florence fought its wars with hired armies. Even William the Conqueror's forces were half mercenary. It wasn't until the rise of the Westphalian nation-state that national armies became standard. And even then, the distinction between soldier and mercenary was often unclear. Today, that line is blurry again. At the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, over half of all US personnel in those zones were private contractors. In Syria, the Wagner Group was hired by Evropolis, a Russian mining and gas company, to capture oil fields from ISIS. Even humanitarian groups like Save the Children and World Vision now hire private contractors to protect their teams in war zones. But mercenaries aren't just on land, they're also at sea. In pirate zones like the Gulf of Aden off the coast of Yemen, or the Strait of Malacca between Malaysia and Indonesia, mercenaries wait aboard arsenal ships. When a client vessel approaches, the mercenaries board it, wrap it in razor wire, man the deck with high-caliber weapons, and escort it through dangerous waters. And once the job's done, they simply hop off and wait for the next client to come along. And that raises a key point. Not only are mercenaries invisible, more reliable than governments, and more effective than many national armies, they're also way cheaper. A US infantry battalion, for instance, cost $110 million a year during wartime, while a mercenary battalion costs $99 million. But here's where the savings get really dramatic. In peacetime, that same army unit costs $60 million, but the mercenaries cost nothing, because their contract ends. No pensions, no veterans benefits, no obligations. This also makes them impossible to regulate, because mercenaries operate outside the reach of most laws, and you can't sue their employers, especially when those employers are states. You can't really prosecute them. You can't just send troops into Africa or send troops into the Middle East to arrest mercenaries. Like it or not, this is now the business of war, and mercenaries aren't going away, because they're faster, they're cheaper, and invisible. In 2019, Mexican authorities arrested the son of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the notorious drug lord who once led the powerful Sinaloa cartel. On paper, it looked like a major victory for the Mexican military, but within hours, cartel gunmen had seized control of the city of Culiacan. Hundreds of cartel gunmen flooded the streets, armed with things like machine guns, rocket-propelled grenade launchers, and even armored vehicles. They set fires, blocked highways, and took soldiers hostage. The government, fearing mass civilian deaths, released him. A criminal organization had just gone to war with a national army and won. This wasn't a protest or a riot. It was a tactical, coordinated assault carried out by a non-state actor with more manpower and mobility than many small countries. And it's not an isolated case either. From Hezbollah in Lebanon to the Wagner Group in Africa and Ukraine, today's wars are no longer limited to states. So what's actually driving this shift? First, there's the decline of state control. We tend to think of strong, centralized governments as the norm, but for most of history, that was not the case. Empires collapsed, warlords rose, private armies fought on behalf of kings, on behalf of merchants, and even on behalf of popes. The stable modern nation-state is a historical anomaly, and as some global institutions and states weaken, we're sliding back into something older and more chaotic. Second, the tools of warfare have changed. You don't need tanks or air power anymore. A militia with cheap drones can destabilize global supply chains. A charismatic ideologue can radicalize thousands from a basement studio. And third, maybe most importantly, private wealth is now competing with, and in some cases surpassing, state power. For example, the Yoido Full Gospel Church in South Korea is the largest megachurch in the world, with approximately 480,000 members, billions in assets, and operations across dozens of countries. If it wanted to build or hire a private militia to protect Christians in war zones, it absolutely could. Or look at Walmart. It has more employees than the population of some countries, and its annual revenue exceeds the GDP of 150 nations. If Walmart declared itself a sovereign actor tomorrow with its own private military, the world would have to take it seriously. The monopoly on violence has been broken, and so has the monopoly on war. States are still powerful, but they're no longer the only ones on the battlefield, and in many places, they're not the most effective. So when wars are no longer waged by states, and the most effective weapons no longer fire bullets, the old definitions of victory collapse too. Because how do you win a war that doesn't even look like a war? In 1968, something happened that would change warfare forever. At the time, the United States was deeply entrenched in the Vietnam War. The US was backing the government of South Vietnam, trying to stop the spread of communism. Their enemy was the Communist North, which was supported by both China and by the Soviet Union. The US had over 500,000 troops on the ground. Its military was vastly superior. Officials in Washington were confident, and they believed they were winning. But then came a shock that would change everything. On the Vietnamese New Year, called Tet, North Vietnamese forces launched a massive surprise assault across South Vietnam. It became known as the Tet Offensive. They struck more than 100 cities and towns in a single night. The offensive shocked the world, but here's what most people miss. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a disaster for the North Vietnamese. They suffered enormous casualties and failed to hold any territory at all. On paper, they lost. But it didn't matter, because the real war, the one that really mattered, wasn't being fought on the battlefield. It was being fought on television. And for the first time, American living rooms were flooded with raw, brutal images of chaos, of body bags, and of destruction. The illusion of control shattered. Soon after, Walter Cronkite, one of the most trusted news anchors in America at the time, went to Vietnam himself. What he saw changed him, and when he returned, he looked into the camera, his voice steady but heavy with resignation, and told the American public, "We are mired in stalemate." President Lyndon Johnson reportedly turned to one of his advisors and said, "If we've lost Cronkite, we've lost the war." And he was right. It was a turning point, not on the battlefield, but in the national psyche. Because from that moment, American public support for the war collapsed. The anti-war movement swelled, and although the US would continue fighting for years, it was never the same. American troops eventually withdrew, the city of Saigon fell, and Vietnam was reunified under communist control. Years later, a US officer was at a conference with his Vietnamese counterpart who had fought for North Vietnam during the war. The US officer told him, "You know, you never defeated us on the battlefield." The Vietnamese officer answered, "That may be so, but it's also irrelevant." The North Vietnamese understood something that's even more true today. In the information age, real-time media, social platforms, and AI-generated content mean perception is always up for grabs. You don't need to win in the traditional sense. You just need to make your enemy's people stop believing it's worth fighting. That said, democracies are at a disadvantage in modern wars because their leaders are far more vulnerable to public opinion, sentiment, and election cycles. Autocrats and the heads of non-state groups don't face those same constraints. They don't need to maintain public support to the same degree. They can wait, they can absorb losses, and they can outlast. In modern conflicts, time becomes a strategic asset for them. But for democracies, on the other hand, time is a strategic liability. The longer a war drags on, the harder it becomes to sustain public backing. On the other hand, authoritarian regimes, terrorist groups, and insurgent movements have weaknesses of their own. Their power often depends on the perception of their power, on appearing invincible, strong, and unshakable. But with social media, perceptions can be manipulated, and reputations have never been so easy to destroy. Many of these leaders also fear rivals more than they fear enemies. They're constantly paranoid about things like coups, betrayal, and cracks in loyalty, and that paranoia can be exploited. What all that means is victory itself is now political and no longer purely military. You can win every battle and still lose the war. You can drop the most bombs, kill the most enemies, and occupy the most territory, and still fail. That's not to say that military force is no longer a significant factor, because it clearly is and it always will be, but it no longer guarantees victory, because now victory and defeat have meaning in political terms, and failure to translate military victories into political ones equals defeat. That's exactly what happened in the Vietnam War, in the Iraq War, and in Afghanistan. When you define victory purely in military terms, you may defang the conflict for a while, but the underlying issues have not been resolved. So if that's the case, are decisive victories even possible anymore? It's getting harder and harder to say. When wars are political, when the battlefield is the human mind, when conflicts play out through sabotage and through mercenaries, and when war and peace coexist, victory can't be seized. When some of the most important battles are invisible ones, you can't really declare victory either. That's what makes modern war so disorienting, Because if we have trouble defining what it means to win, then what exactly are we fighting for? Everything we've covered leads to one inescapable truth. The old rules of war no longer apply. War is rarely declared anymore. It isn't always fought by national armies, and it doesn't take place solely on land, in the air, or at sea. Today, war is waged with narratives, private contractors, and economic coercion. It unfolds in comment sections, supply chains, sea lanes, and shadow markets. This isn't theory. Many states and non-state actors have already adapted. The ones struggling are those still clinging to the old rules. And that has consequences. Because if your assumptions are outdated, then every strategic decision you make will be flawed. You'll underestimate threats, misread moves, fight the wrong battles, or worse, never realize you're in one at all. Even the international laws of war were created for an era where combatants wore uniforms, wars were declared, and accountability was visible. But how do you apply those laws to deep fakes or disinformation campaigns run by proxies with no flags? And that leads to something deeper, a moral reckoning. Because modern warfare doesn't just blur the lines between war and peace. It blurs the lines between intention and effect, between legitimacy and perception, between ethics and outcomes. What counts as just or lawful differs radically across nations and cultures. And in wars where narratives matter more than norms, morality itself becomes a weapon, shaped, warped, and deployed for strategic gain. Liberal societies may believe in ideals like transparency and justice, but war, especially modern war, rarely respects ideals. It rewards those who understand ambiguity, and it punishes those who ignore it. Even though it may be difficult to accept, turning a blind eye to this reality doesn't uphold morality, it endangers it. Because in a world defined by strategic subversion, morality without strategy leaves you exposed. You don't preserve your values by ignoring threats. You preserve them by confronting them intelligently. So if Western democracies want to endure, they must develop grand strategies that reflect this new age. Strategies that subvert hostile forces without betraying the values they exist to protect. It's a monumentally difficult task, but a necessary one. And that brings us to the new imperative. In a world where conflict is constant, power is obscured, and perception shapes reality, strategy matters more than sentiment. Emotion is not defense, and good intentions don't stop drones, mercenaries, or disinformation. Only clarity does. And maybe that's the hardest truth of all to accept. That war isn't a brief departure from the norm. It's not a chapter we've closed. It's not a relic we've outgrown. Even when it recedes in some places, war is and will remain one of the constants of the human condition. There aren't many things I'm absolutely certain of, but I'm certain of this. No matter how enlightened we become, conflicts driven by pride, greed, ideology, and fear will endure. It's often the fruits of that very enlightenment, the technologies we create, the systems we build, the ambitions we unleash, that open the door to new forms of conflict on new terrain. That's why the ancient Greeks spoke of something called the tragic mind, a mindset that accepts that most choices in life, especially in politics and war, aren't between good and bad. They're between bad and worse, between wrong and less wrong. And no matter which path you choose, there will be consequences. It's not a call to abandon moral principles, but to realize that clarity is not just moral clarity, it's clarity of consequence. The price of that clarity is often pain, but its reward is wisdom, and its result is survival.